So now we're on to talking about surveys and how we can use surveys to try to ascertain values of non-market goods, particularly outdoor recreation or the value of natural areas. And we're going to talk about two types. The first is contingent value survey, and then the other is a choice model. So a contingent value survey would be something like asking someone, how much are you willing to pay to have air quality in, let's assume we're in Los Angeles, be 10% better, have 10% less smog. Or if you're in the Smoky Mountains on top of Clingman's Dome, you're at the trail, and as you go by on your way to the summit, some guy's over there with a clipboard and he's asking you, how much would you be willing to pay to have this Great Smoky Mountain National Park be 50% less congested, right? To only see 50% of the cars that you do now and 50% of the people. So that's a contingent value survey. A choice model is where the surveyor gives the subject a choice between multiple different choices with a monetary value on them that have different levels of different attributes. So both examples now. Let's say in LA, someone says, okay, you got three choices. You can pay $10 a month, or hypothetically, if you paid $10 a month and the air quality was 10% better and there were 10% less traffic and there was 10% less crime, would you prefer that or paying 20% more in taxes and then there's 20% less air pollution, 20% less crime, 20% less traffic, or 30% on all variables? Or in the Smokies, the surveyor says, hey, would you be okay with a $20 entrance fee to the Smoky Mountains National Park if it meant you'd only see half as many people and you would see twice as many red-cheeked salamanders and there would be 50% less congestion in Cades Cove, and you build out the variables and maybe something about air quality in there too. Or choice number two, there's a higher entrance fee and you see fewer people and more salamanders and it's easier to get through the park without having to stop, etc., up to like 3 to 5 choices, because beyond that people's heads just can't handle anymore. There are too many choices on the table to even state what your real preference would probably be. So that's the difference. Contingent value, the advantage is you've got the variable of interest isolated, and the person knows what the variable of interest is. And for you as the researcher, that's a little convenient because now the math isn't very hard. Whatever the person says they value your variable of interest at, that's what they value it at. Whereas with a choice model, you've got these 3 or 4 or 5 variables floating around. You have to do some very complex math to tease out what is the value that person places on each one of the 3 to 5 variables. You have to run some interaction variables and things of that nature. The advantage of a choice model, on the other hand, is number one, you can test multiple variables at once, and number two, it's probably a little more believable for people because they can see, like, okay, the more I pay, then these other variables get better. This one's a little more hypothetical, and someone kind of has to come up with the value themselves. And that's a disadvantage here, is it's difficult to conceptualize a contingent value survey. And the disadvantage for the choice model is really a difficulty for the researcher and not the person taking the survey. Like we said, it's harder to do the math and interpret out what the values of those variables are. So some problems just overall with surveys here. Number one is the mental difficulty of isolating a variable. And this is really kind of specific to contingent value. So let's assume again that we're in the Smokies, because I like, Bethany and I like going there a lot, so let's just assume we're back there. And we're in Cades Cove, and the surveyor says, how much value would you place on seeing only half as many tourists here? They don't want to know the value I place on seeing more salamanders or more bears or getting through the park more quickly, not having to stop, or air quality, or all of that. But in my head, it's very hard to decouple those things, because the fewer tourists I see in the park, the faster I can get through the park. That means there's going to be less traffic. And it means the wildlife is probably going to be closer to the main roads, like Little River Road and Rich Mountain, because there aren't as many cars scaring them away from those roads. So I'm going to see more wildlife. So you're likely to see a much higher number than you really place on just that one variable. Maybe your true value on only seeing half as many people is only like $10, but you're thinking in your head, well, but I'm going to see more bears, I'm going to see more deer, I'm going to spend less time in traffic, so that's worth a lot of money, and you say a really high number. Because to ask somebody to take those variables apart and say, what do you value each one at, is kind of like, in some cases, asking people to say, how much do you value the jelly on a peanut butter and jelly? It's kind of a ridiculous question, because the jelly is integral to the sandwich, and that's the context in which you know how to value it. All right, the second one is called avidity bias, and like how avid somebody is, right? So you're more likely to bump into somebody who goes somewhere a lot and cares a lot about the place when you're doing a survey. So let's assume we are in South Carolina, right? We're at some nature center near Charleston. And the average person who goes there only goes there once a month. But we bump into somebody on our survey who goes there every single day and is a really avid birder. And they give us really high values on everything. Right? If we're going to take that person's answer and then go to, I don't know, the Charleston County commissioners or whatever the city governing body is and say, look, this is how much your nature preserve is worth. This is how much people value it. We're going to have a really big overestimate if we're taking that one person to represent the average citizen of that town, or even if we're taking them to represent the average visitor to the park. So it's called avidity bias. The way you get around that is you have an adjustment where you ask somebody as part of the survey, how often do you come here? And then, using a little math that we're not going to get into here, you can adjust for how likely you were to bump into them on the survey, and now it's no longer a problem that somebody is more or less avid. Okay, but caring bias, that's also a thing, right? This is more a thing like if you're giving a survey in person, and who are the people that are going to take it? Are probably the people who care already about the thing that you're surveying on, right? So again, that'll probably drive up the value, and you need some estimate of, what about the people who didn't take my survey? What's the value they probably place on it, and what proportion of people that walked by me were they? The next one is protest answers. And this one is really interesting because some people will tell you they value a place at 0, which is kind of nonsensical, because if you're at the place and spending your time at the place, your time has value, so you obviously don't value it at 0. But there are a few reasons for this. Number one, someone could be thinking, if I say I value it highly, there will be an entrance fee that I have to pay in the future. So I'll say 0, right? Because there's no cost to saying 0. Another reason is, with legitimate reason, many people have reasons to distrust the authorities that they think would probably put in whatever program you are trying to design, right? So if you go to East Tennessee or you go to Southwest Virginia, somewhere where 1 or 2 or 3 generations ago, everyone in that valley knew somebody whose land was destroyed by the Tennessee Valley Authority, and where their grandfather was baptized or got married is 300 feet deep under a lake, you're very likely to receive a lot of zeros if you come in and say, hey, how much would you be willing to pay in extra income taxes to fund a new yada yada yada, or to protect this river that you care about, or whatever. Even if they do place a value on that, and their true preference would be, yeah, I'd pay $100 a year to protect this river I fish in, or these woods I hunt, or whatever, you're going to get a lot of zeros, because they just don't trust the authority that they think is probably putting it in place. Okay, now there are 2 ways around this. Number one is, instead of going from 0 straight to, say, I don't know, $10 or $20 or whatever, you include an option that's like 10 cents. Right? Because if people aren't willing to say, yeah, I value this place that I'm spending my time at 10 cents, then it's a protest answer. Like, just by the fact that they're walking through the park, they must value it at least 10 cents, because the value of the time they're spending there way exceeds that. So if someone says no to that, like 5 cent or 10 cent answer, you can say, okay, this is a protest answer I'm getting. This person doesn't really value it at 0. And then the other way you can get around it is to have a believable mechanism. So if you know you're in a place where you're likely to get a lot of these protest answers, don't leave it vague. Don't say like, and don't use authorities that are far away as your proposed mechanism. Say like, would you be willing to pay to the county? Or would you be willing to pay just a specific entrance fee to this park? Or something like that, like an authority that's closer to home that isn't associated with, say, the TVA stuff that we were just talking about. So that will get you at least some people who are likely to give you a protest answer to give you a real answer. And then those who still do, you can kind of weed out with that really low value. The next one is, again, the believability of the choices and the mechanism. So if people just don't believe that if they pay, in a hypothetical future, the value they're telling you to somebody that anything will get done, they just believe it'll be wasted or whatever, then they're likely to tell you a much lower number just because they don't see the mechanism for accomplishing the desired change or protecting the place as believable. And if you have unbelievable choices, like if your choices go the wrong direction, where if you pay nothing, then you get all the best attributes you possibly can. Like if you're doing a survey of scuba divers, would you rather pay 0 and see 100 sea turtles and see this many types of fish and no other divers? Or would you rather pay $50 and then see fewer sea turtles and fewer fish and more divers? Your variables are going the wrong direction, where of course everyone's going to choose the option that's 0 and the best stuff, and they're probably not going to put much believability in your survey because, again, the causality runs the wrong direction. Another one's agreeableness. This is kind of a thing in human nature, right? Like we like to go along with other people's stories to some extent, and we like to not tell them what they don't want to hear. This can sometimes cause problems, but on the whole is a pretty useful instinct we have. But what this means is, let's imagine this. You're giving a survey in some urban area, and you're asking people, how much would you give to save the polar bears? Everybody who takes your survey, number one, you're more likely to get people who care about polar bears. Number two, everyone who's taking your survey knows what side you're on. They don't think, oh, this person probably wants me to take a survey, about how well I value polar bears because they hate them. They all know this person loves polar bears. I'm going to say a high number because I want them to think that I'm virtuous, and I want them to think that I'm likable and that I care about the same things they do. So agreeableness is going to kill the results of your survey and make them wildly inaccurate. Now, how do you combat that? Combination of a few things. Poker face, don't show what side you're on, and control questions. So the question that you actually care about, you hide it. You hide it in the middle of the survey and do your best to ensure that the people don't know exactly which option you care about or which question you care about. And that way you can't always eliminate it, but you get a lot less bias from just people's agreeableness and telling you what you want to hear. If you make it hard to gauge, and you make it hard for other people to gauge what they think you want to hear, then this bias goes away. So poker face, bury the question you care about in a bunch of control questions and warm-up questions. Another one is that it's cost-free, right, to say a high number. This one you can't eliminate because you're just taking a survey. You can't, force someone to pay something to take a survey. So this is just a problem you're going to have to deal with and trust people to be a little truthful. And then this one, demographic mismatch. So let's say that we are in Arizona and we're out on Apache Native American reservation land. Or we're down in southeastern Arizona. I'm forgetting the tribe that's down there, kind of in Cochise County. And the majority of the people that use that land for hunting, for fishing, for outdoor recreation, that spend their time on it, are Native Americans who live there. But you're doing a survey and you bump into a group of 10 herpers from out of state who've all traveled from New York and Missouri and California and Idaho, and they're giving you these astronomical numbers on what they value that place at. Okay, it's okay to have them as part of your survey, but if you take them as representative of the people who use the place, you're going to get some funky numbers because they're just a small proportion of the people who use it, and they have wildly different interests and wildly different income levels and wildly different travel costs than most of the people who use the thing. So you might want to say, okay, what proportion of people who use this land do I think come from this county or at least this state? And then I'll add questions on my survey, like what state are you from, what county are you from? And I'll weight based on that, so that if I accidentally get way too many people from out of state or out of the county or whatever, I can adjust for that. And then you solve that problem. All right, the last one you got to watch out for is weird interests or skin in the game. You're doing a survey of some land, and you accidentally bump into somebody who you don't know it, but they own a chunk of that land. Or they own a chunk of land adjacent to it and they don't want it developed, right? Because it would affect their quality of life. So they might respond with some numbers that are even higher than their real willingness to pay to preserve that site or whatever. And the only way you can watch out for that really is just toss outliers. You know, a value that's just way different than anything else in your data set, toss it. And then the last one, I kind of have it up here as a joke. I just want to tell a quick story. The worst people in the world to survey are probably economic students because they know what you're doing and they know all this stuff. And if you run into a mean one or someone who's in a bad mood or wants to mess with you, they might give you an outlier just to mess with your math and give you something to go back and fix later. There's an interesting study, I think might have been at University of California, but don't quote me on that. And it was on the tragedy of the commons problem, right? The tragedy of the commons problem says that when there's a common pool resource, you should use as much as you can, because if you cut back a unit, no other person in the group has an incentive to also cut back. They'll just eat up the share that you were gonna use. So even though it's in everyone's long-run best interest to conserve the resource, it's in everyone's short-term best interest to grab as much as they can before the common pool resource runs out. There's been a lot of scholarship showing that that's not really a problem in most third world countries. Most third world countries and societies have developed ways to cooperate around those kinds of resources without needing formal enforcement mechanisms or taxes or anything like that. But the survey showed that the only group of majors who performed in accordance with the expectation of that theory were the economics majors. Every other group of people found a way to cooperate and solve the problem and kind of be nice about it. But the economics majors had learned about the tragedy of the commons. So they know the game, the parameters of the game that they're playing and why. And so they performed exactly in line with expectations. So you might want to add a question to your survey on whether someone was an econ student and then just immediately throw that person out. But anyway, that's that for surveys. Why do we do surveys? Because we want to know the value of non-market goods. We want to know the value of things that don't have a market, where they're readily traded, things like air quality, water quality, recreation. But the survey results, only as good as your survey design. Watch out for these problems. Here are your mitigating factors. And the two main types that are in use today in environmental evaluation: contingent value and choice modeling. So I hope you found it useful, and we'll see you for episode 4.